Thank you, folks, for joining us. We'll go ahead and give it about 30 more seconds for people to jump on, and then we'll go ahead and get started. All right. Well, thank you, everybody, for joining us today. Um, Let me get to the next slide here. Yeah, thank you for joining us for the Idaho Center for Fiscal Policy's first 2026 legislative session update webinar. We do this as a series throughout the legislative session. We host once a month. And if you registered for this webinar, you should have been able to register for all of them at the same time. So we encourage you to keep joining these webinars if you're interested in knowing more about what's happening at the State House, or keeping up to date on all of the bills related to tax and revenue that we are following as they go through the legislature as well. Before we get started, we'll go ahead and just do some quick introductions of myself and May, for those of you who may not know us. So my name is Kendra Knighten, and I am the Policy Director at the Idaho Center for Fiscal Policy. I've been with the center for just about 7 years now. And this is I think we counted my 13th legislative session. So I've been working in this space for quite a while and just really enjoy this type of work. And I'll go ahead and hand it over to May to introduce herself.
Yes. Hello, everyone. I'm May Roberts. I am a policy analyst at the Idaho Center for Fiscal Policy, and I've been with the center for 3 years now. So this is my third legislative session. And the areas that I really work in is tax, budget, and education. So looking forward to walking you all through these updates today.
Thanks, May. All right, for some quick housekeeping, we do have everybody on the call muted with the exception of May and myself. That way we can make sure to give our updates as we see fit without any interruptions. But we do encourage questions. We know that the information that we are talking about can be very technical and very wonky. So if you do have any questions, please feel free to put them in the Q&A section below. You should be able to see a little button at the bottom of your screen. We always love seeing questions, especially from this group. You guys ask the best questions. So go ahead and put them in there as you have them. We will stop and answer questions as we have time. And then there should also be time at the end of the presentation for us to answer additional questions then as well. For questions that we're not able to get to, we will try to reach out to you afterward to get you answers for the questions that you have. All right, so for those of you who may not be familiar with the center, we did want to take a moment just to quickly go through our mission. So here at the Idaho Center for Fiscal Policy, we believe in making the right investments today so that our state can thrive tomorrow. We believe policy decisions should be made out in the open in a way that is understandable to ordinary people, and that policymakers make better decisions when they have access to more information. And we advance this mission by working in a number of different policy areas that impact Idaho's budget. And those include budget and taxation, economic security, public education, affordable housing, and criminal justice. Today, you will primarily only hear updates related to budget and taxation and a little bit of economic security. But for any of these areas, if any of you all ever have questions, as always, please feel free to reach out to us. We're always happy to share the information that we have. All right, so before May takes us on a deep dive into the into revenue for this legislative session, we did want to take a few moments just to kind of set the scene for what the legislative session looks like this year. This is a very unusual legislative session, and we have had a lot of moving parts happening since we began just a few weeks ago. All right, so at its most basic, sorry guys, my Apple Watch is buzzing. I'm going to take it off. All right. So Idaho's legislature is a part-time citizen legislature. And that is an important thing to know because what that means is that folks who are elected to be our legislators, they only do this job part-time. They come to Boise for about 3 to 4 months a year for legislative session, and then they might do some work on the off season. But for the most part, our lawmakers are folks who have jobs in their communities, they're living in their communities, and they are just living everyday lives like the rest of us. And with that type of model, it is basically impossible for, a part-time lawmaker to be a policy expert in all areas of policy. Um, that is asking a lot of a part-time lawmaker. And so that's why it's really important for, organizations like the Idaho Center for Fiscal Policy to reach out to lawmakers and share the information that we have about how different policies impact Idahoans. That's also why it's also important for, everyday Idahoans to reach out to lawmakers and share their experiences, share their insights. Because without that type of information, a lot of our lawmakers won't have the full picture when they're making these decisions. So that's just something that's really important about the way our legislature is designed. It is designed for folks to give input to help inform the decisions that they're making. So in Idaho, there are 35 legislative districts. Each district gets one senator and two representatives, meaning that our Senate has 25 members or 35 members, and our House has 70 members. And something that was really unique about last year, and that's continuing into this year, is the fact that last year after the elections, we saw about a quarter of the lawmakers be new to the positions that they were in, meaning that there was a lot of need for education and outreach to these new folks to help them kind of learn the ropes. Um, that also means that coming into this legislative session, they have already gone through one legislative session and now they feel like they have their feet under them a little bit more. And so they're more likely to be more engaged in the process this year. Another thing that impacts the way sessions work is the election cycle. Idaho's lawmakers are elected every 2 years for 2-year terms. Um, and you can see a trend that happens with legislative sessions based on that. So on years where there are no elections, that's when our lawmakers tend to have longer sessions. That is when they aren't necessarily in as big a rush to get out of legislative session to go home. And they spend more time, debating bills. That's often when the big bills will go through, things like that. Election years, on the other hand, and this year is the election year, tend to be shorter and they tend to have more controversial bills come up. And that's because here in Idaho, where we have a supermajority of Republicans in our legislative bodies, you can see the chart on that pie chart shows how many Republicans we have compared to Democrats. That means that most of our elections are actually decided during the primary elections, and those fall in the spring. So most lawmakers who know that they're going to have a primary person going against them want to get out of legislative session as quickly as they can so that they can go home and campaign. But in addition to that, during election years, that's also when we tend to see more of the controversial bills because lawmakers like to, show that they are putting forward legislation that their constituents want them to put forward. So that makes for short sessions that are really busy for the most part. Um, and then for every legislative session, they come together during the beginning of January, and then they basically just continue meeting until their business is complete. Um, Business is technically complete whenever they've set the budget. That is what they are required to do as a legislature. But then they also get to define what that means for themselves. So sometimes they have, priority legislation that they will not go home until they have passed it. And sometimes that type of thing can keep them in session for longer. This year, their target is to adjourn sine die on March 27th. So adjourning sine die is the official end of legislative session every year. And the target date is rarely met spot on. So we do have a tradition on our team to take a poll to see everybody's guesses for when Sine Die will actually happen. So May, I'm curious to hear what your thoughts were this year.
Yeah, so I think that they're going to take a little bit longer. I think that it might be a little bit optimistic. I would love for them to adjourn March 27th, but with all of the talk about the budget and some of the budget challenges that they're discussing, as well as some budget cuts, I think that it might draw out debate a little bit longer. So I think that I put my bet as like the second or third of April.
Yeah,
Just a little bit longer.
think that's what a lot of people in our team have said. I am a perpetual optimist and I'm hoping for March 27th. I very rarely win at the guessing because I remain an optimist, but I'm hoping that
Well,
it'll
I
be
hope you're
March
right.
27th this year. So one last thing to point out before moving on from this slide is just the number of bills that we saw last year. So as I mentioned, last year we saw a lot of new lawmakers come into the legislature. It was their first legislative session. There was also quite a mix-up with leadership last year. And because of that, it did lead to some procedural differences that also made it so that we saw more bills than we've ever seen before. If you look at this bar chart along the bottom of the screen, you can see years compared to each other for bills passed, bills introduced, and then the length of session. And if you look across these, you can see that the number of bills passed remains fairly consistent. Last year was not an unusual year in any way when it comes to the actual number of bills passed. But where it really stands out is the number of bills that were introduced. Last year, we saw way more bills introduced than we ever have before, and that kept our entire team really busy as we were trying to track more bills than we've ever had to track in the past. And that is the same legislature that is meeting this year for 2026. Um, I believe I heard that they have an extremely high number of RSs, which are proposed bills, waiting to be introduced once they start doing that. But we haven't quite see that trend continue yet this year. But I anticipate that it will, and that it will continue to be another very busy year. Before I move from that slide, May, is there anything you want to add?
No, I think you covered it really well. Just that, yeah, the n number of bills introduced, like we even saw a bill introduced this year to limit the number of bills that can be introduced. So it's definitely out of the norm. Last year was very busy.
Yeah. All right. So the thing that basically starts off legislative session every year is the governor's State of the State address. And it's during that address where the governor goes into the legislative chambers, where the House, the Senate, and the Supreme Court justices have already all convened, and he gives a speech. And in that speech, he reveals his policy priorities for that year. And at the same time, that's also when his recommended budget for all of the state agencies is also released. So this is a pretty significant time for session because this is when we really get to first start getting a sense of the tone of the legislative session. Because it is also fairly traditional that the governor holds this budget and this speech pretty close to the chest until the actual time of the speech. Um, so this year, just wanted to highlight that the governor really focused on protecting education funding, expanding Idaho Launch, strengthening rural health care, and then he also talked quite a bit about federal tax conformity and red tape reduction. And May will be specifically talking about federal tax conformity later. But where we really want to highlight things is on the right-hand side of this slide, where you can see that the governor's proposed budget includes pretty significant cuts, shifts, and freezes to different different programs. And that's really a trend that we've been seeing coming into session, which again, May will give us more information about. But what we saw come out of that budget was a sense that there was going to be a lot of budget cuts happening this year. And that's something we're very concerned about because we do support the programs that help Idaho's kids and families be able to thrive. All right. And then just some other significant changes that happened this year. So there have been some pretty substantial changes made to the House leadership. So Representative Wendy Horman was previously the co-chair on the Joint Finance and Appropriations Committee, also known as JFAC. That committee is responsible for making all of the budgeting decisions for the state. And since they are the ones that hold the purse strings, they are largely seen as the most powerful committee in the legislature and making the co-chairs of that committee some of the most powerful people in each individual chamber. But Representative Wendy Horman received an appointment from the Trump administration and has left her seat. And Representative Tanner has been named as the new co-chair from the House side. And this is pretty significant because Representative Tanner does have a pretty distinct view of how budgeting should be made. And it is very, trying to think of the word. He is in favor of doing a lot more budget cuts and cutting a lot more programs than past co-chairs we've seen be. So we do have, some pretty significant concerns about him being in that type of role, and we are, working to see how we can work with him and the entire committee to ensure that programs are protected. As part of that, there are also several other shifts for committee leadership, which you can see on the slide. And then finally, I just want to highlight some important dates for this legislative session. The first date on here is February 23rd through 27th, which is the primary election filing period. So this date is incredibly important because that is when the folks who are running for the primary elections in the spring will have to file as candidates. Um, and up until that moment, any type of vote that they take could decide whether or not somebody decides to run against them in that primary election. So it is likely that we will see some of the more controversial bills wait until after that February 26th deadline, until after that deadline, so that there aren't, people coming in to run against lawmakers for however they voted for controversial bills. That's something that we saw happen with the school voucher votes a few years ago. We had a lot of lawmakers who voted against school vouchers, and then out-of-state groups came in and started funding people to run against them to support school vouchers. And that's a pretty significant reason why we had so many people in the legislature last year. So this date's becoming more and more important as those national organizations having their eyes on us is impacting our elections. And then the other big one on there is that March 27th sine die target date, which I'm still holding out hope will be the sine die day, but I will likely be disappointed again. So I think that's the end of the legislative updates. May, is there anything you want to add before we move into your policy updates?
No, I think you got it all. I just might tag you if you have any input on the slides I cover today.
Great, thanks.
Mhm.
Well, I know you're all here to actually hear the policy updates. So thank you for bearing with me. It is an interesting legislative session already, and it's about to get really interesting. And I'll hand it over to May so she can talk about that.
Great, thank you. So yeah, so first I'm gonna just go paint like a general overview of Idaho's revenue, how things are funded before I really dive into the decisions that are being made at the State House this session. Next slide. Yeah, so Idaho's revenue system is built on a three-legged stool. So all of the state's money comes from taxation. So we have property taxes, sales taxes, and income taxes. Next slide. And where do those taxes go? So they all go into very specific funds. So income and sales tax flow into the general fund, where then that's the fund that funds most government services. And then property taxes are just flowed to local governments to support local city projects like local water, roads, schools. And property taxes can be like levies and bonds on your property tax bill. And then income taxes are levied on individuals and on corporations. And then sales taxes and use taxes are just every time you go to the grocery store, you pay 6% of that towards taxes. So today we're just going to be focusing on the general fund in the state government, to be very specific. There's lots of other funds and things too, but the general fund is the largest pot of money that the legislature has discretion over where the funds go. Next slide. Yeah. So to run you through how the income tax has changed over the last 5 years, we're going to have to go back to 2022. And that's when we saw the income tax beginning to lower. All of these bills were sponsored by the leadership in the House. And we saw that, first of all, our income tax brackets, it used to be so the more that you earned, the higher tax rate that you paid, but they began collapsing. So back in 2020, they went from 7 to 5, in 2023 from 5 to 4, and then in 2024 finally collapsed completely to 1. So everyone pays the same rate on their income. While these income tax brackets were collapsing, the overall rate was also lowering. So over the last 5 years, we've lowered the income tax rate from 6.9% all the way down to 5.3% most recently last year. And that's the same rate for both personal and corporate income. So there's been huge changes in the income tax over the last 5 years that we've been keeping track of. And that's resulted in $4 billion in lost revenue over that 5 year period. And looking forward over the next 4 years, we look to lose an additional 4.5 million or billion dollars due to those recent income tax reductions. To kind of wrap your head around how much money that truly is, so that's 19% of the overall revenue as a share of the general fund revenue. So we've lost nearly 20% of the general fund revenue that we could have been collecting over that period. And you can see this presented in a slightly different way here on this chart. So you can see more of a timeline and where those bills went into effect and how the gap generated. So in that dark blue line on the lower side, it has income tax collections. Those are actual income tax collections at the state level. And then the light blue line on top is what the income tax collections would have been if there were no tax cuts. So you can see just how large that gap has gotten over that period of time. And something else to note as another thing that's affecting our state revenue is the long-term effects that budget holdbacks have had on our state revenue. So all these gray out periods of time are times that the states experienced recessions. And you can see that during periods of recession, the governor decided to hold back the budget or enact budget cuts. Those terms can be used interchangeably. And you can see how the revenue goes down. This example is per pupil public education spending in particular, to paint the picture. So the recession goes into effect, the governor does a holdback, revenues go down. We start to recover when we're out of the recession. Another one hits, revenue tanks again, and we start to recover, and then another recession hits, and revenue tanks again, and then we start building back up. So you can see illustrated in this chart that per pupil public education spending hasn't truly recovered from those 3 periods of economic hardship. Like today, we're spending $9,344 per student, whereas back in 2002, we were spending $10,640. So we're getting closer back to where we were, but we're not quite there yet. Another thing to consider when we're talking about our general fund revenue is you often will hear discussion about like our budget is growing, the budget's out of control, it just keeps getting bigger every year. We need to slow down this growth. You kind of hear those kinds of arguments. And when you look at a chart like this, that general fund appropriations over the years, you could say, sure, it looks like the budget is growing quite a bit over the last 20 years. But when you take the time to adjust it for population and for inflation, you can see that that's actually really flat. If you could go to the next slide. And this is because when you adjust for population, that's, when more people move to the state or the population grows, you have more people that are paying income taxes and sales taxes and buying things. And then inflation over time as well really contributes to how the budget truly has remained flat over time, and it hasn't grown exponentially like the first chart implies. So that's why, at the center with all of our charts, when we're looking at these figures over long periods of time, we'll adjust for inflation. So we're comparing apples to apples. Can I pause there and just see, Kendra, did you have anything to add over those last few slides?
I didn't have anything to add, but we did have a question. I don't
Mm-hmm.
believe we have the answer available at the moment, but we'll see. So how much revenue would Idaho bring in if the corporate tax rate were increased back to that 6.9% level?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I'd love to explore and find the answer. I don't have that figure in front of me.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure we have the number. We just don't have it readily available. But thank you for the question, and we'll try and follow up with you.
Yes.
Yeah, I think you did a great job, yeah, explaining the tax cuts and how they've impacted our just revenue in general. And I just really want to emphasize again, because I think it's worth saying again, that as we are continuing to see our lawmakers want to continue to cut taxes that impact the revenue that goes into our general fund, those are dollars that are going to see that continue to go down. And those are the dollars that we use to fund our public schools, like to make sure that Medicaid is available to, promote public safety throughout our communities, build roads. Like these are the dollars that all of us rely on to live in a community that is healthy and safe and thriving. And so whenever we're talking about these types of significant cuts to revenue, what we're really talking about is also a dwindling budget available for the legislature to be able to meet those needs. And that's why we are really concerned about this trend that May talked about these revenues going down as a result of tax cuts. Um, but I'll hand it back over to May. Thanks.
Great. Thank you so much. So then, after getting all of that background information on how we got to where we are with our revenue, uh, I'm gonna drill more down into Idaho's budget process and the decisions that are being made this year. Um, so for those of you guys that don't know, Idaho's budget process really begins when the governor releases his budget proposal during the State of the State address, and he gives all of his legislative priorities. Kendra ran through them earlier in the presentation. And then a committee called the Economic Outlook and Revenue Assessment Committee, also called ERAC Committee, um, recommends a revenue target to JFAC. They get a lot of presentations from economists in different areas, from universities, from the state, from banks, and they just get a lot of information to determine where do they want to set the revenue target. Are they going to agree with what the governor set it as? Are they going to come up with their own? Then they take a vote and they send that revenue target on to JFAC, the Joint Finance and Appropriations Committee. They say this is what we think the revenue target should be for this year and the upcoming year. And JFAC then takes a vote on whether they agree with the committee, if they're going to come up with their own estimate, or if they go with the governor's estimate. They have some debate. This year, they went with the committee's recommendation. And then after that, the Joint Finance and Appropriation Committee will approve the agency maintenance budgets. So they categorize this as anything that's used to keep the lights on, keep the agency running for another year. Oftentimes it's the same amount of funding as the previous year. And then after that, they approve supplemental budgets. So if there's any gaps in funding from last fiscal year to this fiscal year, or last session to this session in the same fiscal year, if there's any gaps they need to fill. And then the last step is funding additional programs and services with remaining revenue, and they call those enhancement budgets. So anything above and beyond what they need to do their daily operations. So that's the usual flow of the budget process through session. And right now, they're at the point where they're still getting some presentations from agencies hearing their budget requests for the year. So they've set the revenue target, but they haven't begun approving budgets yet. Kendra, do you have anything to add in this budget process?
I mean, the only thing I would add is that the legislature did adopt the target revenue, and it was higher than the governor's recommended target revenue,
Yeah.
which I just found really interesting.
Yeah, it was interesting. I'll talk about it just a little bit more too. That they went into the session with a budget deficit projected, and we're assuming that they have to make a lot of cuts. But with the revenue target that they set, technically they wouldn't necessarily have to make all of those cuts. So that's some debate that we're going to probably be hearing in the Finance Committee going forward. All right, so a little bit more about that. So in December, the Division of Financial Management releases a economic report on how Idaho's doing with collections versus what they projected would the collections would be, so actuals versus estimates. And they were like, at the end of the fiscal year of 2026, we'll have a budget deficit of about $40 million. Um, and LSO gave a presentation saying that, and then in the following fiscal year 2027, the projected budget deficit could be much higher at 600 million to a billion for 2027. And that's due to a couple of different factors. Um, like I mentioned before, they have some population adjustments that are automatic. That's kind of like a formula. So your budget will increase a little each year because of that. But also, a lot of agencies are pushing off their enhancement requests to next year to help make up a deficit for this year. And then they want like a cash balance cushion. And there's also the issue of tax conformity, which I'll dive more into in a little bit. So all of those factors brought together had a much higher budget deficit predicted for next fiscal year. However, just last week, the January Budget Monitor came out and they recorded much higher corporate income tax collections than they had anticipated, putting Idaho back into the positive by 106 million for fiscal year 2026. And so that got people questioning, like, oh, does that mean we have enough money, like we don't need to make all of these cuts anymore? But that really has to do with whether or not they go forward with tax conformity and how much that actually ends up costing the state. And another thing to mention that these projections do include the 3% permanent holdbacks to agency budgets that help balance the state budget. So all of those estimates do include that holdback that the governor enacted in the fall. And that tax conformity piece of it, so lawmakers each year have to consider whether they're going to adopt federal tax changes. And estimates came out with a pretty big range between 115 to 284 million. So it's a lot to consider. How it's such a huge range. So lawmakers really have to figure out what they're going to choose what their estimate is going to be. So in short, going into session, lawmakers were considering whether they needed to cut budgets, raise revenue, or use rainy day funds to balance the budget. But now with revenues ahead, it's really looking like if they adopt tax conformity, are they still going to have to do all of these things, even though the revenue looks ahead right now because it's such an expensive line item? Kendra, do you have anything to add some additional context into these budget considerations?
Again, I don't have any additional context, but we do have a question.
Great.
And this has to do with last year's projections. So didn't they base their budget last year on faulty projections? Are we at risk of that happening again this year?
I mean, so that's a great question. The thing is with estimates is that they're estimates and they are guesses on it. What was really going on last year was they set their revenue target very late. So they were passing budgets and making budget decisions like huge tax cuts, um, a tax credit, some other enhancements before they even knew what their budget was, what the revenue target was. So they ended up passing a revenue target that really, like, aligned with some of those policy priorities. But this year they did set the revenue target early, so hopefully they'll be more measured and they're making their decisions. So they'll actually have like a target revenue number early on. So that's really positive this year. You want to add some context, Kendra?
I know, I think you did a good job
Okay.
explaining that. We are very happy to see that they are not following last year's trend and they've gone back to setting that budget number early.
Yes, definitely. Kendra gave a great presentation last year about how it was all out of order. And so if you see this revenue budget or this budget process slide, that revenue target piece in the dark blue on the top, it was after the supplemental budgets. So that was crazy.
Yeah.
Actually, I think it was at the very end, if I think about it some more.
Yeah, it was at the end of a lot of the enhancements, but yeah,
Hmm.
they're not doing that this year, thankfully.
Yes, of course, corrected there.
All right, and then we have another question about the conformity bill. Would you like that question now, or do you have a another slide later?
Yeah, I'll take it right after this next slide. So I'll
Okay,
dive into conformity. All right. So in short, tax conformity is the state's decision to align their code with the federal government. So every year, it's usually a very straightforward process. Idaho usually just conforms, and it doesn't have that big of a fiscal impact. It's really like a formality so that accountants can file taxes easier, individuals can file taxes easier. You kind of just do one form. It's really the same at state and federal level, other than like some additional maybe tax credits at the state level that you wouldn't get at the federal level or vice versa. So this year it's very different because the One Big Beautiful Bill, or OB3 or HR1, whichever way you want to refer to it as, it has a lot of new deductions and tax credits and things like that within it. A lot of tax breaks for individuals and corporations alike. So you've probably heard about in the news, no tax on tips, no tax on overtime, no tax on auto loan interest are some of the big ones. Um, and then there's some additional corporate ones for like research and experimentation. And now the state has to decide, wow, there's big tax changes at the federal level. Are we going to mirror it at the state level and adopt it so that we also give the same tax breaks at the state level? Um, that complexity with all of those changes has resulted in a lot of different estimates for the cost of tax conformity. So the cost estimates range from 115 to 184 million, and that comes from our tax commission. They estimate between 115 to 192 million. And then the tax foundation estimated in the summer that altogether would be 284 million. But the Tax Foundation acknowledges that they don't have all of the information. They couldn't model everything, and to defer to local revenue agencies when available, which is our tax commission. So there was that caveat there. But it is worth mentioning that the Tax Foundation didn't model all of the different tax conformity pieces, like all the individual provisions. So their estimate could very well be higher than that initial one. And then I was personally surprised to see that the tax conformity bill came up really quickly in the session in the House Revenue and Taxation Committee, and it was introduced as House Bill 519. And I was also surprised to hear that they want to make the bill our tax conformity to be effective at the beginning of last tax year, so January 2025. The governor's um, budget has it not going into effect until January of this year to help with that budget deficit, to help cushion that gap. Um, but maybe it's because revenues came out higher than anticipated. The lawmakers the lawmaker that introduced this bill decided to push it back to last year. I'm not really certain on that, but that it is notable that there's a difference there between when it would go into effect. I can stop there and answer any questions.
Hey, we do have a couple questions. The first, on the conformity bill that was introduced, are the tax breaks, I think it's an investment tax credit, for corporations creating jobs in other states included?
Yeah, so something that we talked about in one of our other reports was these corporate tax breaks the benefits often don't stay within the state for multi-state corporations. So no, there is no guarantee that the benefits from giving tax breaks to corporations would stay within Idaho.
All right, thanks.
Mhm.
And then this other one's a little bit more broad about tax policy in general, and I'm happy to answer it if you would like me to. Do you feel that lawmakers would reverse some of the tax cuts or add new taxation, for example, vaping, this session? Or are we looking for them to not pass more tax cuts this session?
Hmm. You can take this one, Kendra.
I am happy to take this one. It's a very good question, so thank you for asking it. We have not seen an appetite from the legislature for them to reverse any of the tax cuts that they've enacted over the last 5 years. They intend to keep those tax cuts in place. So, really, what we're looking at this year is what are the ways that they are trying to further cut taxes? Who is that impacting the most? Who's benefiting the most? And how are they going about doing that? So with the tax conformity piece, that is something that we do have a lot of concerns about with how it would impact our revenues. One, because it makes a lot of really substantial changes to our tax code. But two, as May pointed out, the estimates for how much it would cost the state are all over the place. So we're not exactly sure what those revenue changes would look like if they were to be enacted through the federal tax conformity process. Also, coming into this session, we had also heard that it was very likely that Speaker Moyle would like to further reduce the income tax.
Oh.
Tried to boot me. We've known for a while that Speaker Moyle has wanted to reduce the income tax to a full flat tax at 5%. We are now at 5.3%. So coming into this session, we thought that that would be the tax cut bill that we'd be dealing with, but that was before we fully understood what this conformity would look like. So it's a matter of, again, where they're cutting those taxes and how they're doing it. We do anticipate there will be tax cuts made, and we will be trying to provide as much information as we can about how those impact folks. But then May can share a little bit later about some, ways of tax cuts that we do support that do help to support families.
Yeah. And then as far as the vape tax piece, I personally haven't had any conversations with lawmakers, so I'm not sure where they stand on that, but I have heard from advocates that there's some appetite for pursuing that this year. So we'll see what happens there.
I
Uh,
do have one more question. I
mhm.
don't know if you have the answer in front of you. On the conformity cost to Idaho, what's the breakdown between the corporate breaks versus the breaks to individuals?
Oh, yeah, that's a good question. So I can pull it up really fast and we can share it with you guys in the chat as well. This is just with the tax foundation estimates. The tax commission didn't separate their analysis between the two. They lumped all of them together. Um, but with from the tax foundation estimates, they said it's 164 million for personal income tax deductions and then 117 million in corporate income tax businessing provisions. So that's how they broke it up.
All right. For the sake of time, I'm going to stop asking you questions and let you keep going, and then we'll do the rest of the questions at the end.
Okay, sounds good. You can go on to the next slide. All right. So something that is very important to us, and that we've been following for a really long time and trying to protect is the child tax credit in Idaho. So Idaho's child tax credit is $205 per child, and it ended in December. So it had a sunset date of December 2025. So this year would be the last year that families could claim the credit because you claim for the previous previous tax year. Um, and losing that will result in a tax increase for low to middle income families, even with the tax cuts passed last session. Um, it we care about it a lot because it is an effective tool for reducing childhood poverty, and families that use this money like spend it on necessities, like food, clothing, school supplies, and we have some data on that as well. So this cost credits between 66 to 68 million to Idaho families every year. And so we're doing our best to try to get it included in any tax legislation this year. Next slide, please. So this is an analysis that we completed at the end of the session last year when no action was taken to renew the child tax credit, but significant income tax cuts were made. This looks at the all of the tax changes for personal income combined together. So House Bill 40, so it's the combined impact of House Bill 40, so that's the income tax cut to 5.3%. House Bill 231, which was an increased grocery tax credit, and then the expiration of the Idaho child tax credit. So taking all of those tax changes together at the end of the session, we found that middle income families will actually get a tax increase, and some low income families would see no change or a little bit of tax relief due to the grocery tax credit expanding, which everyone's eligible for because it's refundable. But the only people that got significant tax relief from these changes were those with very high incomes. So we just like to highlight that there to show all these tax changes don't actually benefit everybody. There are some people that will be experiencing increases to their taxes with the loss of the child tax credit. Um, and that's I think my everything I have to say, unless Kendra would like to add anything.
Yeah, again, I just wanted to highlight that the child tax credit is an example of the type of tax relief that the center supports because it does specifically help those with kids, with families. And like May said, it is a very important tool to combating childhood poverty. So we love to see, tax programs that target specific populations to make sure that, all families have the opportunity to keep some money in their pockets, keep their families healthy, keep them safe. And the child tax credit is a great example of that. All right, so that does bring us to the conclusion of our webinar. Before we open it up for Q&A, did just want to encourage you all to make sure to follow us on social media and to sign up for our newsletter. We do these webinars once a month, but if you want to stay up to speed on what's happening on a day-to-day basis, following us on social media or signing up for our newsletter is the quickest way to have access to that information. And you can sign up for our newsletter by going to our website, idahofiscal.org. I do also want to mention that, we are a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization. We do not receive government funding, and we do rely on gifts from folks like you to be able to continue doing our work. So if you do feel moved to make some sort of contribution to the work that we do, you can also find some giving options on our website as well. Um, May, is there any closing statements you have before we look over at the Q&A?
Just thank you all so much for attending. It's so amazing to be able to chat with other people really interested in these topics and to help keep you informed. So just really appreciate you spending your lunch hour with us. Yeah, and we'll see if there's any other questions.
So we do have one question asking if the recording of this presentation will be available. Yes, if you go ahead and send me or May an email, we can send it to you. And I'll put our email addresses in the chat here in just 1 second so you have those. And then the other question, which I will see if May has the information available, but it might require more digging than we have time for right now. May, what is the dollar amount for each of the three legs on the stool for fiscal year 26? So sales tax, income tax, and property taxes.
Great question. I would have to pull up the general fund revenue book to snag that for you. I know that income tax is the biggest one, so the biggest slice of the pie. And then property tax, it's not, I don't have that all together because that's determined at the local level. But if you send me an email, I can follow up with you with the specifics. I just have to pull up some resources.
And I have put both May's email and my email in the chat. Please feel free to reach out with any questions. Um, okay, we have another question that I think we can answer broadly, but we may defer you to our healthcare team for the rest of the answer. So how will the proposed Medicaid cuts affect Idaho's disabled and low-income, skilled nursing homes, assisted living residents, and medical providers? Do you want me to tackle that one, May?
Yeah, I mean, I can only speak to the provider cuts a little bit or provider rate cuts. It just makes it more difficult for doctors to accept Medicaid because they're going to be reimbursed at a lower rate. So I know that impact, but for others, you can go ahead and speak to the other ones, Kendra.
Yeah, I won't speak to any of them individually. Healthcare is not my specialty, but we
Mhm.
do have a team as part of our organization that does specialize in healthcare, so we'll make sure to connect you all. But what I can say is that we do know that Medicaid is one of those programs that is being discussed as, one of the programs that the legislature can look at to cut costs. So we are really concerned about what programs they may decide to cut or which funding they may decide to take away from that program. So for those of you who, are supportive of Medicaid funding and do want to make sure that our communities and our families are healthy, I do encourage you to stay up to speed on these discussions because they are going to be big discussions happening this year, and to make sure that you're letting your lawmakers know your opinions about Medicaid and other social service programs that help lift up families. All right. Well, we made it through all of the questions that we have in the Q&A. So I think we'll go ahead and let you all have an extra few minutes to your lunch break. But again, just thank you all for joining our webinar today. We really appreciate you taking the time to learn a little bit about what's happening with legislative session, and we hope to see you at our next webinar. May, any closing thoughts?
No, just to repeat what I said earlier. Just it's great to have so many engaged people attend our webinars and want to stay up to date on these wonky issues. So thank you so much for being with us today. Always great to chat with you all and hear what questions you have for us.
Great. And I'll leave the webinar running for a few minutes for those of you who still need to grab our email addresses or the link that's there. But with that, I hope you all have a lovely Tuesday, and thank you again.